Hey guys, I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you today, but I wanted to keep going with our notes. So to review, what we've looked at so far in the course has been the colonization of North America, with England and France coming over, making colonies. Eventually, the British colonists declaring independence from England, wanting to become their own nation. Um, the American Revolution, which obviously we won, and then the creation of our Constitution that told us how the government was going to work. Um, so now we are a brand new country. We're going to look at some of the important first things that happened in our nation. So the federal courts, when we talk about the federal courts, that's the Supreme Court. Remember that the Virginia Plan separated our national government into three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So this is the judicial branch, the federal courts. And this guy here is Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. So on the Supreme Court, there are 9 judges, and the Chief Justice is the one who makes all of the decisions. He's sort of the boss of the Supreme Court. He's from Virginia. He was the 4th Supreme Court Justice in the United States. And he made 3 important rulings, so 3 cases that came to the Supreme Court while he was Chief Justice. Those decisions really increased the power of not only the Supreme Court, but also our federal government. So we're going to look at how our national government really starts to get much more power as a new nation. So the first case that we need to know about is Marbury versus Madison. So Marbury versus Madison was a case that came to be because when we were switching presidents, the first president tried to give someone a job sort of on his way out, and the next president didn't want to hire that guy. So there was a lawsuit. But what you really need to know is that the Supreme Court decided, based on this case, that they could say if actions or laws were unconstitutional. This gave the Supreme Court a huge power called judicial review. So John Marshall said at the end of this case, the Supreme Court has the ultimate job of deciding whether or not federal laws or actions follow the Constitution. Our job is something called judicial review. If we say it doesn't follow the Constitution, it doesn't become a law. Okay, so Marbury versus Madison is how the Supreme Court starts that power of judicial review. The next big case that we need to know about that made the Supreme Court more powerful, as well as the federal government, was a case called McCulloch versus Maryland. So the United States established what they called national banks. So banks that were federal banks, but set up in all of the different states. And some of the states didn't like that because the national bank started to compete with the state banks and the local banks. So the state of Maryland said, okay, we're going to get back at the national bank. We're going to tax the national bank. We're going to make the federal government pay us taxes. John Marshall in the Supreme Court said, no way. The states are not allowed to charge taxes on the federal government. Okay, so 2 big decisions here. Supreme Court Justice Marshall says that the federal government has implied powers. So things that they're allowed to do that aren't exactly in the Constitution, but are based on the Constitution. So the Constitution doesn't say, exactly the federal government can establish national banks. But it does say that the federal government has the power to control commerce. So Marshall said that this went along with that, and that Congress is allowed to make necessary and proper laws based on the Constitution, and the states were not allowed to tax the federal government. So it shows not only that the federal government has some powers that aren't exactly in the Constitution, but also that the federal government is supreme to the state governments. The third case that we need to know about that showed how much stronger the Supreme Court was becoming, and also the federal government, was Givens versus Ogden. So what happened here was the state of New York tried to prohibit other states from moving or transporting goods in the ocean around the state of New York. The federal Supreme Court said that's not fair. New York can't limit other states from using their water, right? So it gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce. So when states can't figure out how to work with one another, that's the federal government's job. So when more than one state is involved, the federal government has the power to regulate. Okay? So you can see in all of these cases, the Supreme Court is making big decisions and the federal government is getting a lot more power. So all three of these cases made the court the supreme authority when dealing with different issues. So when we have three types of issues, the court makes the decision, the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court makes decisions when the three branches of government have issues working with one another, like in Marbury versus Madison. The Supreme Court makes decisions when different levels of government are having disagreements, state and national. And the Supreme Court makes decisions when businesses are competing, for example, in Gibbons versus Oakton. Okay, so under John Marshall, the federal court's power expanded. And you're going to look in your classwork today a little more in detail at those three cases so that you can really see what happened. So obviously our first president was George Washington. He had been such a great military leader in the American Revolution that it just made sense for him to become our first president. But George Washington didn't want to have too much power and stepped away from the office. He didn't want to be like a king. He wanted to give someone else the opportunity. But when he was leaving the office of president, he made this quote: "A system of political parties agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, and foments occasionally riot and insurrection." What the heck is he talking about here? George Washington is saying that political parties, when people split, like today we have Republicans and Democrats, that can really cause problems for the country because we have people within our own country arguing with one another, right? Animosity, stirring up riots. And we see that today, right, with the two political parties that we have. So George Washington is really warning people that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't have two political parties. Well, of course, we know that we do end up with different political parties. And after Washington's presidency, the first political parties emerged. So political parties are basically groups of citizens with different ideas about how the government should work. Don't get this confused with our Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Those were not political parties. Those were just different groups at the Constitutional Convention, different ideas about how to make the Constitution. These guys are actually going to be political parties that send representatives into government based on their ideas. So our first two political parties are Federalists and Democratic Republicans. So we're going to look at each party, sort of what they believed in, who their big supporters were, what their ideas were for government. So our Federalists were led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, two of the founding fathers that should sound pretty familiar. And what did they believe in? You should remember Federalist back when we were talking about the Constitution. These guys were a fan of a bigger central government to protect our country. So they liked a strong national government. They believed in an industrial and commercial economy. So that means they wanted our country to make money by making things in factories, by artisans making things, and by selling those items. They supported bankers and business interests. So these are mostly our northern folks. These aren't going to be our plantation farmers, right? Those are not industry and commercial. This is going to be folks interested in a commercial economy, making and selling goods. So that's mostly going to be in the Northeast. On the other side, our second political party is the Democratic Republicans. These guys were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They are from Virginia, so they are from the South. What did they believe in? These guys believed in a weaker national government. They wanted the states to have control over their own affairs, their own business. Why? The same reasons the Anti-Federalists had. They were scared that a national government wouldn't know what was best for all the different states. and that people's rights would be taken away. They believed in an agricultural economy. They wanted our country to grow things like cash crops, tobacco, cotton, things that grew well in the South, to make money. So who were our Democratic Republicans? Mostly farmers and frontier folks in the South. So in 1800, we had our first election after President Washington left office. So we had a nominee who was a Democratic Republican, and we had a nominee who was a Federalist. So you can see that our Democratic Republican was Thomas Jefferson, who ran for president in 1800. And if you look on the map here, you can see who tended to vote Democratic Republican. Obviously, it's a majority in the South, right? Those farmers, those people that were more interested in states' rights, tended to vote for Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. Whereas our Northeast folks, industry, bankers, commercial, they tended to vote for the Federalist John Adams. So Thomas Jefferson won the election versus John Adams, the Federalist. So we have a Democratic Republican president as our third president. This was the first time that power was peacefully transferred from one party to another. What does that mean? So George Washington was our first president. Our second president was Adams. He was a Federalist. This time we had our Democratic Republican win. So a different political party is going to be in charge. That could have caused a huge war or a riot. People could have totally freaked out about that big change in ideas, but they didn't. So that's what made this country so great, was that we were able to peacefully move from one party to another, peacefully transfer power from a Federalist president to a Democratic Republican, and people respected the process, respected the political process. And we've been doing this for years, right? Sometimes our president is a Democrat, sometimes it's a Republican, but we peacefully accept the decision that voters make. So that was a huge, huge, huge deal for our country. So what you're going to do for your classwork today is you're going to look at those 3 Supreme Court cases that I mentioned, and you're also going to read a little bit more about these first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and sort of what each one stood for.